Just 50 miles from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea lies a deep scar in the face of the earth, long known as the Valley of Siddim, the Vale of Salt, or the Jordan Valley. Its most recognizable feature is the Dead Sea, which sits approximately 1,400 feet below the Mediterranean shore, which would be sea level. The exceptionally salty waters of the Dead Sea, along with an unusual climate, make it a truly unique place on the face of this earth. And despite its depth, the Dead Sea lake surface continues to fall. How much? We'll see in this series. In this multi-part series, we're going to explore the origins and history of the Dead Sea, examining the significance from both a geological and biblical perspectives. We're going to ask questions that have been explored by scientists, historians, and theologians alike. How did the Dead Sea form? What are its origins? What secrets lie beneath its waters? How does its history align with biblical accounts? And what can this unique body of water tell us about the Earth's past and future? The Dead Sea is Earth's lowest elevation on land and the deepest hypersaline lake in the world. As of 2021, its surface stands at approximately 1,400 feet below sea level, having dropped nearly 1.5 meters or around 3 feet per year over the last 2 decades. This rapid decline is primarily attributed to human activities, including water diversion from the Jordan River and mineral extraction industries that occur at the south end of the Dead Sea. So the Dead Sea is in some trouble. Its waters are receding at an alarming rate, leaving behind a landscape dotted with sinkholes and abandoned shoreline resorts. Here you see a new valley formed by erosion of what were sediments that were not long ago lying underneath the Dead Sea. But now the Dead Sea has retreated, leaving these soft sediments to easily be eroded. And that's the problem with the sinkholes as well. So this crisis, and it is a crisis for those that live in this area, it does offer this unique opportunity to peer into Earth's past and ponder some of these big questions about science, faith, and the age of our planet. You see those layers of sediment right there in that valley being exposed to us? We can do some very detailed analysis of those. And they tell us something about past events, past climate, past event like earthquakes are actually recorded in these layers of sediments. The unique characteristics of the Dead Sea, I think, do make it an invaluable climate archive. It's storing a lot of information about what was the Dead Sea region like in the past. 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. How long ago? How far can we go back in the annals of the Dead Sea sediments? Its sediments do provide us a really high resolution record of past climate changes in this drought-sensitive Mediterranean region. And I'm going to show you that in one of the future episodes of this series. This area has also played a large role in the development of human civilization in the region. And we're going to talk about some of the towns and cities that have been present, where they were around the Dead Sea and how long ago that they existed. If you want a quick analogy, a quick comparison of the Dead Sea to other places on Earth, there are other locations that are below sea level, but nothing as dramatic as the Dead Sea. I think a very similar, an analog to that would be Death Valley in California. But Death Valley is only 282 feet below sea level, and it's not getting any farther below sea level. In fact, it's filling up with sediment at a very, very slow pace. But nonetheless, there's more sediment being drawn down from the basin that it sits in. From these mountains in the background there are eroding, right, and bringing sediment down and laying it in this plain. You see that white surface there. That's all in crusty salt across the bottom. So once in a while, with heavy rains, you do end up with a lake here. I can show you that. Right here I am standing in one of the deepest places in Death Valley. And this is in April, so there had been some spring rain. Made this very temporary location here, this very temporary body of water, which will soon dry up, leaving a whole bunch of salt behind. So Death Valley is, in a way, it's kind of a similar sized basin, and it is below sea level, but the Dead Sea is truly a spectacular site on this earth, and kind of blows away the Death Valley in terms of the depth of sediments that are below what I'm standing on. Right, what I'm standing on here is several thousand feet of sediments that have filled up this valley to this point. We're going to see that the Dead Sea is sitting on top of a whole lot more sediments than that, including enormous amounts of salt, up to several kilometers. So, what about the geographical and hydrological context of the Dead Sea and the Dead Sea Basin? See, in this first episode, we're just going to be sort of like hitting the highlights of some basics about the Dead Sea. And then each of the subsequent parts of the series will take a really deep dive into a lot of research that's been done and sort of try to get like the most modern, up-to-date, conventional understanding of what's going on here as we then begin to explore questions about the age of the Dead Sea and how that fits in with biblical concerns. So the Dead Sea Drainage Basin, it covers an area of approximately 42,000 square kilometers. There are several different climatic zones that are covered. If you go all the way to the farthest north, there are mountains in that area, and those mountains then on the sides, they actually have snow on them a good portion of the year. That's melting. And at least on one side of the mountain, the south side of the mountain, that ends up draining down into the Sea of Galilee through what becomes the Jordan River, right? And then the Jordan River continues on down until it reaches the lowest point, which is the Dead Sea, and because this is a basin, I mean, there's no escape for this water. Well, I mean, there is an escape for the water. It can evaporate, okay? But it's not going out to sea. It has nowhere else to go. And so the boundary here represents all the land that drains into the Dead Sea Basin, with the Jordan River being your primary water source. The Jordan River is the only perennial river that flows into the Dead Sea. Perennial river meaning it's the only river that has continuous flowing water. All the other rivers or streams or wadis that run into the Dead Sea are temporary, in which case like only during the annual rains would you ever see water in those. And sometimes some of those don't have water in them for maybe decades at a time, and it's an extremely rare event. You can see over here in this image that the bathymetry of the Dead Sea, and that would be the shape of the sea itself, right? And 700 meters deep. I mean, it's an extraordinarily deep lake. So you might think, wow, that's all flowing down into 1,400 feet below sea level, and that's the point at which the surface of the Dead Sea sits. But below that, there's still another almost 2,000 feet of water, which then begs the question, how low can it go, right? How far down could the Dead Sea end up going? And we're going to address that question. I think it's in part 4. And so that's, well, apparently it could go a lot lower. And then we're going to even ask the question, has it ever actually dried up altogether? I'm not going to give that away just yet. Now, despite the name, the Dead Sea isn't like entirely devoid of life. I mean, it's extreme salinity, about 34%, compared to typical seawater, which is 3.5%. So that's 10x, right? 10 times the saltiness of normal seawater. And that does create a really unique ecosystem that supports some very specialized microorganisms that live here and really nowhere else on Earth. There's halophytic organisms. That would mean those are salt-loving organisms that have extreme adaptations for being able to handle that amount of salt. These are primarily bacteria. The shores have some variety of salt-tolerant plants, such as tamarask trees, and these plants do play some role in stabilizing the shoreline, providing some habitat for wildlife. There are animals that live in that area. There's ibex, hyrax, various bird species. It's a unique ecosystem. It's unlike any other place on Earth. And as the water level drops, it affects the delicate balance of this surrounding environment, and that leads to local microclimates and some wildlife habitats that have been adjusted over the past. So there's a lot of concern in that area about just, the balance of water in the Dead Sea. I mentioned the Jordan River, right? I think many of us may have an image of the Jordan River. When we think of rivers. Here you'll see this small stream that's actually leading out into the Dead Sea. And you notice this is a very barren landscape. That's because all of what you're seeing here that is land was, a decade ago actually underneath the Dead Sea, all right, underneath the waters of the Dead Sea. That's how much the Dead Sea has been dropping. I said it's been about 3 feet a year for the last 20 some years. So it's gone down a long way. And that's led to this very barren landscape. And then what you have is the Jordan River that is eroding through former sediments that were on the lake bottom. And of course, that does offer opportunities for us, and we're going to look at some of those. We're going to look at the sediments that are on the walls of these canyons that have formed in different places around the Dead Sea in order to sort of go back through time looking at the sediments in those walls. We're also going to look at drill cores that go down through the bottom of the middle of the Dead Sea, which are going to be very informative to us. There it is. There's the raging river of the Jordan. All right. So yes, I think when we picture crossing the Jordan, we think like there's rushing waters and like it's going to be really hard to get across there. But I'm not saying this is, I'm not saying it's ever always this low, but many times there's not a lot of water in the Jordan River, and especially today. All right. There's a lot less water in the Jordan River today because, hey, people upstream want to irrigate and pull water out of the Sea of Galilee and actually places above the Sea of Galilee even in order to use it for, drinking water and all the rest. And so that has severely limited the amount of water that actually ends up in the Dead Sea, which is, one of the reasons why it's still sinking. All right. Actually, sinking isn't the right word. It's evaporating away. All right. One more little tidbit about the Dead Sea here. So what we have here is we have this brownish area, which represents, again, the basin where all the water is being drawn to or drawn from for the Dead Sea, showing the Sea of Galilee. And we're going to talk a bit about the Sea of Galilee. By the way, the Sea of Galilee is below sea level itself. I think it's 700 feet, at least below 700. Yeah, I think at least that much. Oh, it's on one of my future slides. This line drawn here is, and you see that it says Lake Listen, all right? And that particular lake is a paleo lake, which means ancient lake. And we're going to look very closely at the evidence for the existence of this very large lake. And you see that the lake extends well below the south end of the Dead Sea and well above it, in fact, goes all the way above the Sea of Galilee. Suggesting that this basin once was quite full of water, forming an extraordinarily large, very long lake at one time. This graphic over here is a very simple graphic showing over the last, say, 5,000 years that the Dead Sea level has fluctuated. All right. And it's gone down precipitously in recent years. In fact, this only goes up to 1950. This is an old figure. And it's gone down a whole lot since then because it's now 435. So it would be down here now, right? It's down here. And so we've seen a big drop off. But if you go back in historical records, for which we have over the last 1,000 years, it's gone up and down quite a bit. And it's because, there's rainier years and there's drier years, right? And when we get a lot of rain, more monsoon type rains, it tends to fill the basin up a little bit and then it dries up and so forth. And if we look farther back, and this is where we're going to have to do some work to look at the sediment profiles and look at the other types of evidence there are for where the ancient levels were, but we think that in the past it's been much, much higher, 100 meters higher, so almost 300 feet higher than it is today, which at that time would put a lot of places underwater that are presently well above the Dead Sea level. But we'll get to that. And we'll even ask the question, can we go much deeper in time and ask questions about long-term history? Now, I'm using this figure, which I turned on its side for a reason, so you could get a feeling for the whole length of the valley. And so we'll see that this is a rift. This is two continental plates that are actually sliding past each other and kind of opening up right here, resulting in this rift valley. But I'm only showing this figure really to put this into your mind, where this is going to come up later when we talk about the history of the Dead Sea, the origin of the sediments, and so forth. You'll notice that right here at Mount Carmel, all right, there's this little projection of rock here. Well, there's actually a fault that runs through here. That's a crack in the earth, right? Right. And this piece of land here is basically sliding out this direction, slipping past here. As this is all slipping up, there's been a couple other side branches, right, basically to the rift, and that's pushing Mount Carmel out. And so there's a little projection right here. So you can just watch this coast here. It's pretty even, and then all of a sudden bump right there, and then it kind of comes back again. But what I really want to point out is the elevation. And you notice right through here, there's basically a valley. This valley right here runs right around sea level. All right, these colors over here are just not very much above sea level at all, right? Under 100 feet for sure. And then there's a little area here that's a little bit higher. And so there is this valley that almost connects to the Mediterranean. That'll become an important later because we're going to ask the question whether the Dead Sea Rift has ever been connected to the Mediterranean Sea. And that could have something to do with explaining some of the phenomena of the amount of salt that's found in the Dead Sea Valley. But let's move on to the biblical significance. Again, we're kind of setting out all the different components of what this 12-part series is going to include. The Dead Sea isn't just a scientific curiosity. It's also a place of historical and biblical significance. All right, the Bible mentions the Salt Sea numerous times, most famously as the backdrop for the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. But I'd rather focus on the situation with Abraham and Lot when they gazed over its waters. We also know that David sought refuge in the surrounding wilderness. In Genesis 13:10 we read, "And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered, everywhere like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah," which wouldn't be too soon after that, or too long after that. Now, what does this description suggest to us? I would submit that this suggests that around 4,000 years ago, at the time that Lot and Abraham would have been looking down into this basin, into this Dead Sea Valley or the Jordan Valley, I would suggest that at 4,000 years ago, the surroundings weren't dramatically different than what we see today in terms of the general layout. I mean, perhaps there was a little bit more abundant water, but I should note here that well-watered, the term here, well-watered, when Lot looked down and saw it was well-watered. In biblical times, that likely doesn't refer to abundant rainfall, but rather the presence of reliable springs and streams. There are many freshwater springs, and we're going to talk about the origin of those springs and how they function later on in the series. But there are very reliable springs that are in constant supply of constant water, basically creating little oases that are in the basin area. And this could be used for the irrigation of crops. So this compared to, when Lot's looking down there and thinking about like, well, we got this land over here, running out to the Mediterranean. And although, it's nice, it's got some pasture land and it's got some trees and that seems great. It also was well known to be highly dependent on rainfall. If it doesn't rain, then there's not a lot of productivity. God needs to bring the rain, right, in order to bring abundance to that particular land. Whereas if you go down into the bottom of the valley, well, hey, there's constant springs there. There's reliable sources of food and water. And that would be attractive at that time. It's a little bit like, if you lived along the Nile, you knew there was going to be floods and that was going to bring you water and sediment and allow for irrigation and so forth. And, sort of a constant, source of water and agriculture. Yeah, so the Dead Sea is also featured in the story of David fleeing from Saul. The prophecies of Ezekiel about the future healing of these salty waters. So that's again a reference to like this is very, very salty. I don't think we should be surprised by that this was something that was identified by those in biblical times. So all of these biblical references, what do? They provide us with an insight as to how this landscape was perceived and utilized in ancient times. I'd say for many, reconciling these biblical accounts with the geological evidence of the origin of the Dead Sea poses like a pretty stiff challenge. I mean, that's the reason we're doing this series. This is a very challenging question. The evidence I'm going to present, I think, to me presents one of the greatest challenges to the young Earth creation and worldview. And it's going to take a while to build, why that is. But let's just think about it in this simple way for now. And then I'm going to provide the evidence to back up, what I'm going to say here. We might wonder, what exactly did Abraham and Lot see when they looked down into the valley of Siddim? Where were Sodom and Gomorrah? And like, how were they destroyed? Most people believe that Sodom and Gomorrah were quite close to the Dead Sea as it is today, which means it was more than 1,000. Those towns were more than 1,000 feet below sea level. These questions invite us to consider, how would we interpret both scripture and the scientific evidence? How would they have seen a lake so far below sea level when only, remember this is 4,000 years ago, when only 500 years before that, according to the young earth creationist model, the world was covered with water, which means the basin should have been 100% filled up with water to at least sea level at some point. How did it get this low by the time Abraham and Lot are looking out there and they're seeing an environment that looks much like what we see today? All the descriptions in scriptures talk about this being a very desert environment. And the Dead Sea being about where exactly the Dead Sea is today. And the Sea of Galilee, obviously the Sea of Galilee is referred multiple times to in scriptures, and it appears to be just what it looks like today as well. So it's already taken on its characteristic appearance no more than a few hundred years after a potential global flood, according to young earth creationists. So where do we fit the things of the origins of this rift and of the sediments and of the sea with all of its salt and the fact it's so far below sea level? I am just barely touching the surface of the challenges that the Dead Sea Basin brings to the young earth creationist worldview. All right, let's move on, because I'm going to greatly expand those in other parts of the series, all these different things I'm mentioning here. So let's get a brief overview of what the conventional view of the origins of the Dead Sea are. See, this is where it gets really interesting, but I think really challenging for some Christian views about origins. The Dead Sea, according to the consensus of the scientific community, is a relatively young geological feature. Now, of course, when I use the word relatively young, I'm talking about maybe millions of years, not hundreds of millions of years. It's formed as part of the Great Rift Valley system, and that stretches from Syria all the way down to Mozambique. All right, so down into Africa. This massive crack in the Earth's crust is a result of tectonic plates pulling apart, a process that's likely began millions of years ago and continues to this day. And again, I'm going to spend a whole episode talking about in more detail about this rift and like, how do we know, like, what is the conventional dating? How do they measure where and when this rift began and how it came to be the way it is? So that the Dead Sea sits on what geologists call a pull-apart basin along the Dead Sea Transform Fault. This fault system marks the boundary between the Arabian Plate, right, and the African Plate down here. So the African Plate moving this direction, Arabian Plate moving up to the north. As the plates slide past each other right in this area, right, they also pull apart just slightly. So they're kind of torqued. And as a result, they start to pull apart in some sections. And that causes the crust to thin and to start to sink. And that's why the Dead Sea is so deep. It literally is a depression in the Earth's surface caused by tectonic activity. Recent GPS measurements, global positioning system measurements, have given us really incredibly precise picture of how fast this motion is occurring. And we'll talk about in a later episode, just like how many inches per year this is moving, about 2 inches per year. But we'll get into all these different plates a little bit more. Now, that might not sound like a whole lot, but potentially over millions of years, if this rift had started a long time ago, that adds up to a lot of movement. That adds up to a lot of sliding past and pulling apart. And so that's one of the things we need to ask ourselves, is we're going to talk about the conventional dating of this and how they know how long this rift has been active and so forth. So what happens is the sediments then accumulate in the basin that's forming over time, and they then provide a record of history as well. You know, as soon as it starts to rift apart and sediments start to fill, there's nowhere for the sediments to go. They only just pile on top of each other. So we have this historical record, right? From the bottom of those sediments to the top tells us something about the history of events that have occurred in the basin itself. So, for example, I've made a whole series of drawings to show the different stages of development, and I'm just showing sort of like currently what in a simple form, what the Dead Sea Valley looks like in cross section. So cross section would be in the west part over here. That would be, think of this as being Jerusalem, or like Jerusalem would be up here in the mountains. This is sea level right here at 0. And then over here would be the other side, the eastern side of the Dead Sea Basin. So think of like across the other side of the Dead Sea. And so if you look down into the earth, what you'll see is that you have this rock that's called Miocene rock. That Miocene rock's up here, that Miocene rock's up here, and eventually the Miocene rock is actually all the way up here. That's because this whole thing has been pulled apart, and the center section then is starting to fall down into the crack. Like, how deep of a crack? I mean, it's fallen down, more than 5 kilometers, right? More than 5,000 meters. This thing is fallen down into the earth. And as it is fallen down, then all of this stuff is sediment. 5 kilometers of sediment that have filled up this basin. And we're going to talk about like how long there's been a lake here. Has there always been a lake here? Has the lake ever dried out? How does that sediment get there? How long does it take for that sediment to get there? Most importantly, how long does it take to develop more than 2 kilometers of salt? Right? There's extremely thick salt deposits that lie underneath the Dead Sea Basin. And then there's also interspersed salt layers, thousands of them, in these other sediments that sit above the major salt layer, which is actually fairly far down. And then, of course, the Dead Sea itself is sitting right here in this little basin, which would be the recent times. So we'll get into like how you went from what was there a long time ago to what was there now, and how this then fits with, say, a young Earth creation model. Speaking of the young Earth creation model, maybe we should talk about that a little bit. But wait, you say, you've been talking about millions of years. Well, of course, that's where we're going to run into our potential conflict with some interpretations of the Bible. And that's the whole reason for this series, is to sort of take something that where this conflict is very evident and try to work through some of those issues. Young Earth creationists, I'll probably refer to them as YECs or young age creationists at times. They believe the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. And so they have to squeeze the entire formation and the entire history of the Dead Sea into obviously a very short time frame. Actually, a time frame that's only 4,500 years. Right? And why do I say 4,500 years? Because 4,500 years would be the time of a global flood. And virtually all young Earth creationists would ascribe the geological formations of the Earth to be the result of that global flood. Why? Because they contain fossils. And yes, there are fossils in the Dead Sea Basin. And they view fossils as evidence of past death in the world, which in their minds couldn't have existed at the beginning. Therefore, all the rocks, well, let me go back up here. That means everything that's above the basement rock, which is just granite, all right? Everything that's Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Miocene, we'll talk about the geological ages later, but these thick layers of sediments which contain fossils, all right, down to 13, 14 thousand meters, so almost 15 kilometers of sediment. All of these must have been deposited during the flood. So I got this illustration here. In the conventional dating system, right, you had the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. Mesozoic would be like your age of the dinosaurs. And then over here is your conventional uniformitarianism age. This is actually a young Earth creationist figure, and so they're calling it uniformitarianist age. You don't need to say that. It's just like, what is the radiometric age dating of these different sediments? 2.6 million, 66 million. That's famous for the catastrophic event of an asteroid impact. 252 million, all the way down to 500 million, and these are all the fossil-bearing rocks, right? And so, young Earth creationists, this is their model, all right. This model says all these have been laid down over long periods of time. The young Earth creationist would say that all of this material was laid down early in the flood, which means the first month or two of the flood 4,500 years ago. And then as the floodwaters are receding and falling and sort of moving around and the mountains are being lifted up, some other sediment was laid down. And then you have the post-flood time, which is only the last 4,000 years, and that has only laid down the quaternary sediments. Now, this is just one particular model of young Earth creationism. Not all young Earth creationists ascribe to this model of only the highest sediments being post-flood. So, for example, this shows you two different primary theories that young Earth creationists have. Some think that all this blue stuff here are the flood rocks, right? The Precambrian is the pre-flood stuff that happened between the creation of the world 6,000 years ago and 4,500 years ago. And then you have the flood rocks. Everything was deposited by the flood, the vast majority of the geological column. And that for, say, Answers in Genesis, which is Ken Ham's organization, would be everything up to that 66 million year mark, except it would be 4.5 thousand years for young Earth creationists. But the Institute of Creation Research and other young Earth creationists, like the one I just showed you on the previous slide, that they have it going all the way up to just the 2 million year ago mark, right? Or the quaternary period. But nonetheless, the bottom line is that the Earth is no more than all the stuff that we're seeing, all the geological form, and that includes the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea can't be more than 4,500 years old. And so it has to find its origins somewhere in the recent past. How was it formed? So we're going to have to look at all the layers that make up the basement rock of the Dead Sea. Then we're going to have to look at the sediments that are in the Dead Sea. We're going to have to ask questions about how would these things have formed within a young Earth creationist framework. So can their model account for the excessive salt deposits? That's going to be one of the really unique features here that cries out for an explanation within a young Earth model. What about 5 kilometers of sediments? What about the dramatic changes that we're going to witness, that we're going to see evidence for, that the Dead Sea has been way higher and was a big lake in the past? And not to give away too much, but it's been a lot lower in the past as well. And that's I'm looking forward to sharing the evidence for you that the Dead Sea has been way drier and much farther down and much deeper in the past. And so we're going to see from that, this is a significant challenge to the young Earth creationist view, because there's no evidence from the Bible, from Scripture. Scripture does not provide us any evidence from eyewitnesses who have looked and reported from the Dead Sea region, Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham and Lot. And we're going to look at some other things. We're going to look at a lot of, ancient settlements and so forth that are way down deep in the Dead Sea Basin. There's no evidence they've ever been underwater. And so if they're 4,000 years old or 4,500 years old themselves, then we know that the time when the lake was much higher had to have been before that, right? There's really no evidence that since the time of Abraham and Lot, the water has been a lot higher than it is today. I mean, 60, 100 feet higher, maybe, not hundreds and hundreds of feet higher. So we're going to have to explain thick layers of salt, which look like they require many hundreds, if not thousands of cycles of evaporation, of the Dead Sea filling up, evaporating, filling up, evaporating, right? That's all going to somehow be compressed into less than 500 years. We're going to look at Dead Sea core sediments. We're going to look at annual layers called varves. We're going to count those up and see how many there are, right? So these are going to be the types of evidence that we're going to say is like, these are the observations that we make, and how can we explain the observations from God's world? How do we explain those? Should have been showing this while I was talking about layers of salt. These are recent sediments. Now, recent is still hundreds of years to accumulate this. But you'll see those bright white layers. Those are pretty obviously salt, right? That's when the density of the salt in the Dead Sea got so great that salt precipitated out and salt crystals fell to the bottom of the floor of the Dead Sea. And then at other times you had sediments brought into the Dead Sea, and those sediments are fine, very, very fine sediments are slowly falling out and accumulating on the bottom. And so each different color here would represent different, you might think different seasons, but in this case, it's probably like different climatic changes in the Dead Sea region that might cover dozens of years, if not hundreds of years in some cases. The only reason we can see these now is because the Dead Sea has dropped so much in the last 20 years that it has revealed these sediments for us. All right, so as we progress through this series, we're going to examine how different models, including the young Earth perspective, attempt to explain the evidence we see in and around the Dead Sea. And my job is going to be to try to faithfully and carefully explain the evidence, show you the observations that we have made, and then show you how we can place those observations into different interpretive frameworks. That's going to provide us with this opportunity to consider how scientific evidence and religious beliefs are interacting and what it means when they appear to be in conflict. Finally, I'm going to share at the very end, episode number 12, very long episode, very long chapter of this series. I'm going to share why I believe the observations provided in the series are not in conflict with the message of the Hebrew Scriptures. That's going to take some explaining. Many people have asked me what my position is exactly. Since I criticize lots of other views, other understandings of how to harmonize the evidence of the world in Scriptures, specifically Genesis. And so I'm going to lay out my particular, present viewpoint on that in some detail at that time. But I need to build this case before we get to that particular point. So to understand the Dead Sea's origins and history, we're going to take this interdisciplinary approach, right? We're going to look at some geology. We're going to do some archaeology. We're going to do some climatology, and we're going to do some biblical studies. All right, so that brings me to, hey, what do we got coming up? Well, first we're going to look at the geological and seismic history of the Dead Sea Basin. We're going to look at the unique salt formations and the sediment layers. We're going to look at some at the climate history recorded in those Dead Sea sediments. And that's going to tell us something about how the climate has changed over time. And we're going to need to try to relate that to some scriptural eyewitness evidence from the last 4,000 years. We're going to look at the water level, all right, the sea level or the Dead Sea level over time. And we're going to ask how that correlates to the climatic information. We're going to examine some biblical references to the Dead Sea and the surrounding area and see how they align. How do they align with the geological and archaeological evidence? And then, of course, throughout, really in each individual episode, we're going to sort of present a challenge to young Earth creationism and try to look at how they would respond to this type of evidence. And that will help me explain young Earth creationism to those of you who might not be very familiar with that. And then what about Noah's flood? Where in the world does that fit into the Dead Sea history? I mean, that's going to be integral to, of course, to a young Earth creationist perspective, but also I need to explain that as well. So that's also part of episode 12 is like, what do you do with Noah's flood? How does that fit into the conventional understanding of the history of the Dead Sea? And so all of these things combined, I hope will fill out a very detailed picture of the origin of one place on Earth, a place on Earth that we know a lot about. And the thing about using a place that's a biblical historical place is that we have eyewitness accounts. We know something about what this place looked like thousands of years ago. And we know people have lived here for a very, very long period of time. And therefore that restricts some of the interpretive possibilities. You see, when young Earth creationists look at the Grand Canyon, and there really wasn't anybody living there for a long time, they can kind of, say, well, this could have all happened, and this could have happened. There could have been a big lake there, and then that could have happened. And then, without putting a lot of like strict timelines on those things, but just sort of like they crunch a lot of things into a short amount of time. But the thing about the Dead Sea is that you can't come up with wild hypotheses about, well, maybe it was all full of water and then the water evaporated, then it filled back up. Well, if it filled all the way back up 3,000 years ago, we would have eyewitness testimony to a giant lake. The Sea of Galilee wouldn't have existed, right? It would have been part of the Dead Sea and it would have all been super salty. That would have left some impression in somebody's mind, not just even in scriptures, but also all the other types of texts of other peoples in the area having written about the region. That we don't find that. And so all the things we're going to talk about in terms of origins have to be compressed in a young earth framework into some time before 4,000 years ago, but also sometime after the flood, 4,500 years ago. It's a pretty short time frame. And then we got to squeeze in, an ice age, and there's a whole bunch of other things. So there's a lot to talk about here. So the Dead Sea, with its really extreme environment and really rich history, it does offer us this remarkable opportunity to explore the intersection of science, history, and faith. I think it is going to challenge us to think deeply about the age of the earth, the accuracy of the biblical narrative, and our understanding of God's creation. So we're ready to begin, right? Let's begin by taking a closer look at the current state of the Dead Sea. Like, what is it like right now? What's happening right now at the Dead Sea? What are its environmental challenges? We're going to explore the human activity that's affecting its unique ecosystem, what that means for the future. But then we're also going to start digging deeper into its past, into its geological history. We got to set the stage for a really deep dive we're going to take into the deep history of the Dead Sea. But first, let's start with just the history over the last couple hundred years and what's happening right now at the Dead Sea. So we get really familiar with the Dead Sea before we sort of like I said before, take the deep dive, right? Deep into the basin of the Dead Sea. Until then, thanks for hanging out. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.